The next section deals with perfection and preservation. This section carries from the last section, in which we should understand that Teschia, this whole concept of Teschia and this being a feature of the Prophet ﷺ's mission, this contributed to a foundational consciousness of Allah within the Sahaba. So through Teschia, the Sahaba gained a very deep consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a perfection in their religion. Now, I use the word contributed here because it wasn't the only feature, and I want to make this very clear. There's other features that are necessary. For example, the first mission of the Prophet ﷺ was to recite the ayat. So all of us in this room, if we have any desire to grow our Islam and develop it to its fullest, we have to be engaged with the Quran. In fact, that was the first on the list. So we can't avoid that, and none of us should ever think that we can. A lot of times we think that if we become very active in something, or even if we do a lot of dhikr, or we do a lot of struggle against the nafs, that somehow that's going to replace the Quran. That's not the case. Quran is essential, and engagement, a constant recitation and reading and pondering and growing with the Quran is essential for any person that wants to develop spiritually. And I am going to touch on that later. But I want to remind everyone here that we talked about 4 missions, right? We talked about 4 features of the mission. Number 1 was the recitation of the ayat of the Quran, and so all of us should be committed to that as part and parcel of our spiritual development. Number 2, we talked about this concept of tazkiyah, or purifying spiritually to allow for growth. Right? Number 3, we talked about learning the Quran, the kitab and the hikmah and the sunnah. So these are all things that we need to be doing. Right? And then the 4th is to learn about the things that we don't know. So what are the different rulings of Deen? What's the history of our Deen, etc., etc. These are all things that are also important. So knowledge, let's put it that way. Knowledge in general is also important. We have to have all of those things. That's why I use the word contributed. I'm not saying it was the only feature. I'm saying it contributed to a foundational consciousness of Allah within the Sahaba. So Tazkiyah is one of the core components. Let's say it that way. Now, this Tazkiyah permeated their acts of worship and their character, producing the best generation of humanity. So otherwise stated, we can say that these 4 characteristics that we described, being the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, all of these, they had a multiplier effect, they came together, and they produced the most amazing generation of humanity. That's a pretty amazing thing to say. Like, we can confidently say that we know the most amazing generation in the history of humanity. And the Quran actually describes them. But of course, what was it? It was a consequence of these key features that we described, including tazkiyah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, "Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas." You are the best generation that has emerged for humanity. This was an ayah that was revealed, obviously, to the Prophet ﷺ in the context of the companions. Now, we can be included in this secondarily if we meet those criteria of the companions, striving towards the Deen, etc., etc. But essentially, what's very clear is that the companions were the best community that had ever emerged from humanity. And it was a consequence of the direct work and effort of the Prophet ﷺ upon the companions in order to guide them towards this excellence. A second feature of the companions, which is also amazing, I mean, again, like I said, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to say that you're the best of generations is just phenomenal. Just think about that. It's not a light statement. First of all, it's coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so how can it be light? But second of all, just for any group of people to ever be told that is just amazing. I mean, I couldn't even say that. I teach at a university. I could never say that to one class because I never know what the next class will be. I mean, I could say, you're the best class I ever taught. But people would then say to me, well, what if there's a class 10 years from now that's better? Okay, I would be speaking from my past historical experience. But if I said, you're the best class I'm ever going to teach, you're the best class period ever in the history of man, I mean, I wouldn't be able to prove that. So for the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making such a statement about the companions really highlights the status of the companions. In addition, another important feature of the companions is that their effort, the effort of the Prophet ﷺ upon them, and then their subsequent response to that effort and their inculcation of it, resulted in that, essentially in religion being completed as a whole. That's amazing. That's amazing. Look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states concerning at the very end of the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, "Al-yawma akmaltu lakum deenakum." Today I have perfected your religion for you. And this is at the very end during the final Hajj. "Al-yawma akmaltu lakum deenakum." Today I have perfected your religion for you. وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي. And I completed my favor upon you. وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا. And I have chosen Islam as a religion for you. So here, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. I have completed religion for you, your religion for you. Essentially, what's being highlighted here is that the entire thread of religion, from Adam alayhi salam all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, was completed on that day. Because Islam came initially with Adam alayhi salam, and then is going through various iterations, this submission, let's globally call this the submission. This submission is coming to Adam alayhi salam and then going through various iterations until eventually it comes to its final stage with the Prophet ﷺ. And that's the final Islam, the most updated and preserved version of Islam, which is now there for the humanity until the end of time. So that was the day, there came this day towards the end of this mission where the Deen was completed upon the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. And that completion actively involved the companions surrounding the Prophet ﷺ. So, I mean, again, phenomenal. The Deen as a whole, this thread, you know, you have these email threads and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I imagine you've got this email thread going tens of thousands of years. Right? There's this thread going tens of thousands of years. And then the final completion on that thread occurs at this particular point in time. So, it's just phenomenal that the Sahaba, again, highlighting the amazing state that the Sahaba had achieved through the contributions of Tazkiyah. Now, of course, with the passing of the Sahaba, this didn't end. And the next responsibility became to preserve what the Sahaba had captured. So essentially, let's say this. The Prophet ﷺ was the fountain of Islam. The Sahaba, a huge group of them, were present to capture what the Prophet ﷺ brought. And then the responsibility of every subsequent generation was to continue to capture that essence and preserve it for each generation to come. Sahaba did a phenomenal job. The Sahaba transmitted to the Tabi'een, again, one of the great generations. The Tabi'een transmitted to the Tabi'een, again, one of the great generations. And we know from hadith that these are the three stamped generations, stamped with approval. خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. The best of generations is my generation, then the ones that follow, then the ones that follow. So 3 generations have been stamped with approval. After that, the scholars took over. The scholars of each generation took over. Now, of course, there were scholars amongst the companions. There were also scholars amongst each of the stamped generations. But these 3 generations were the generations that were the best of generations, and then eventually the scholars then took on that role. So this role of preservation, now the Deen has become complete, and the responsibility of preservation goes from generation to generation to generation. Each facet of Deen had to be preserved. It's not a small task if you think about it. Each facet of Deen had to be preserved. What do I mean by that? The Quran had to be preserved. The way to recite the Quran had to be preserved. The hadith had to be preserved. The meanings of the hadith had to be preserved. The legal dimensions of Islam had to be preserved. So what happened was that these various branches of Islamic learning started developing to contain and capture each of the features of Deen. So fiqh concerned itself with the legal dimensions of how to perform various acts and how to engage with one another, and it captured that. Quran captured its preservation was captured, and then eventually as science arose and how the letters should be voweled and how they should be, where the dot should occur, etc., etc. So there was a whole series of work that occurred in order to preserve all of these things. But what was everyone trying to preserve? Everyone was essentially trying to preserve what existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ to begin with. So no one is adding anything. Everyone is only preserving the realities of the time. So, for example, the Prophet ﷺ recited the Quran and the Sahaba recited the Quran in a certain way, with a certain beauty, with certain rules. And so this science of tajweed developed in order to preserve the recitation of the Quran. The wording of the Quran obviously has its set. So the memorization and preservation and writing and compilation of the Quran all became a separate thread. So all of these different features had to be preserved. Now amongst that, one of the things that needed to be preserved was the tazkiyah. The tazkiyah, the spiritual purification, the spiritual realities that had been achieved, the ihsan, let's put it that way, the ihsan that had been achieved, there needed to be a preservation of this as well. So the branch of Islamic knowledge that most concerned itself with preservation of spiritual development became known by many different names. I mean, if I said to you, what's the branch of Islamic knowledge that preserved the perfection in the recitation of the Quran, people would say tajweed. If I said, what's the branch of Islamic knowledge that preserved the legal dimensions of Islam, people would say fiqh. If I asked, what's the branch of Islamic knowledge that preserved the spiritual realities of Deen, the goal of ihsan and achieving ihsan and all of those characteristics of excellence that were present in the Sahaba, there would be potentially a list of names. Some less common, some more common. So we want to talk about those names in a minute. All right. So what are some of the names that are commonly used for this particular branch of Deen? Or I don't want to say branch of Deen, branch of Islamic knowledge. Number one, Tawbah. Tawbah was a very common term used early in this field, because one of the key facets of spiritual development is that a person needs to remove sin. If the person removes sin from their heart, it will allow their Islam to grow and develop. So Tawbah is the ultimate manifestation of that. Tawbah, of course, means to turn to Allah with remorse, seeking forgiveness for past mistakes, and making a commitment to avoid future mistakes. That's called Tawbah. And so sometimes the term Tawbah was used for spiritual development and excellence because of its core role, as we're going to hear later, its core role in spiritual development. Really, spiritual development is essentially a battle of sin. If someone can guarantee avoiding sin, they're going to develop spiritually, so long as they maintain the basics of Islam. Really, the battle of Deen lies in avoiding sin. I'm going to talk more about this later. Another term that was used for this science was ihsan. Why? Because that's the ultimate goal. So it was named after its goal. The ultimate goal of this science was ihsan, and so it was named after its goal. Another name was tazkiyah. Why tazkiyah? Because tazkiyah is the process that was described earlier as being the key feature of the mission of the Prophet ﷺ. So sometimes you would hear the term tazkiyah being used, and it's still used to this day. Another name for this Islamic science is Tasawwuf. Tasawwuf is a term that refers to one of the characteristics of the people that often engaged in this preservation, in the preservation of this aspect of Deen. In that they would often shun the luxuries of the world, and one of the features that you could identify them with is that they would also often cloak themselves, and their clothing would be made of coarse wool. And coarse wool was seen as a less comfortable type of clothing and was less refined and was a indication that a person was less interested in the niceties of the world. So the people who would pursue this dimension of their Deen would sometimes be this would have that characteristic, and so therefore the dimension would be called tasawwuf. From suf. Suf is wool. Another name is Sufism. Sufism, again, kind of has a similar connotation, kind of has a similar derivation, but this word has a loaded connotation. So sometimes I hesitate from using this word because you could use this word and we often know you don't necessarily communicate clearly. So what I mean by that is, if I said to you Teschia, I have I'm pretty confident that you're going to understand some degree of what I'm trying to say. If I said ihsan, I have a confidence that you could understand some degree of what I would like to say. Even with the word tasawwuf, I feel relatively comfortable. But when you use the word Sufism, it's very loaded. Because eventually that term became borrowed and also that term became abused. And when you say that term, I don't know if when I say that word, you're capturing what's in my mind. Really, what are words? Words are ways to communicate. I have an idea in my mind, I say bicycle. I have a picture in my mind of something with 2 wheels and a handlebar and you pedal. I say the word bicycle, immediately you have a picture in your head of 2 wheels, pedals and a handle and something somebody might ride to go somewhere. So words are used to communicate ideas. So when I say bicycle, I know that you understand bicycle. But when I say the word if I were to say the word Sufism, I can't be confident of that. I don't know what you're thinking. There are a subset of people out there that even practice quote-unquote Sufism without even Islam. There are another subset of people out there that will call something Sufism and it'll be way far away from the basic tenets of Deen. So I'm very hesitant to use that word, and you will almost never hear me use that word. I've been learning this subject for 30 years, and I've been teaching this subject for close to 20 years, and I think it would be very few and far between, very few times that I would have used this word. Because again, I couldn't confidently know what I'm communicating to you. Another word that is potentially used is called Tariqa. Now, what is Tariqa? Tariqa means path or way. And the reason this word is often used in the science of spiritual development is because in order to get to the goal of ihsan, you need a path or a way. You need to be given some guidance that here's the goal, what is the direction, what is the path I'm going to take to get to that goal. Now, Tariqa is a little more specific in that it often refers to the package of actions and advices that are going to lead somebody to their goal. So somebody might say, what tariqa do you follow? Or what are the core principles of your tariqa? And again, this term is also sometimes a little bit less clear than I would like to be. And the reason is because when you think about tariqa, well, tariqa is a general term which just basically means way, and anybody can have a tariqa by which they do something. But often when you think about tariqas, there's a subset of tariqas that have more specific names. Like some people will say the Naqshbandi tariqa, the Tushti tariqa. And they'll use these terms in order to sort of further describe the tariqa. So again, I have some hesitation in using that because in this day and age, it's so difficult to know exactly what you mean when you say the Naqshbandi tariqa. Because there's so many different people who may have followed different principles that they eventually attribute to a famous sheikh who had this, from whom the name of that tariqa is derived. So again, I hesitate because again, if I say the word Mercedes, we can confidently know what we mean, because in this day and age, the term Mercedes implies quality, excellence, reliability, etc., value, right? These are all terms associated. These are all ideas associated with Mercedes. But if I say the Naqshbandi tariqa, I don't know if you necessarily have the same idea as I do, and I don't even know what you'd be referring to. So I, again, like to move away from that. What I think you need to appreciate is that historically, scholars of this science would ascertain the condition of the people and make recommendations based on that circumstance. So let me say it this way, because this is a very important principle in spiritual development. The Sunnah is a toolbox. Listen very carefully. The Sunnah is a toolbox. It provides a variety of cures that the physician can remove from that toolbox in order to treat the people that they're engaged with. It's like a medicine cabinet. Some of the medicines are essential. They're not even medicines, they're nutrients in food, salah, et cetera, et cetera. Those are essential, there's no discussion. But there's other more specific medicines in this toolbox, or tools in this toolbox. Now, what the scholars of spirituality, what they would do is that they would identify the condition of their time. They would see what the circumstances are that surrounds the people and what they need to do in order to bring them to the goal of ihsan or excellence in their deen. And based on that, they might emphasize one thing more than another, and that would then become eventually a tariqa if enough people would follow that way. You understand what I'm saying? So that's historically how these developed. So let's just say, for example, I'll give you some very clear examples. Historically, the classical way by which individuals would be encouraged to develop their ihsan would be to, one way would be to focus on curtailing the animalistic desires in themselves, which is called the nafs. So one major dimension of spiritual development is to curtail the nafs, the animalistic desires that exist within a person. Another major way of spiritual development is to do dhikr. Another major way of spiritual development is to express adab or etiquettes. So historically, in the very earliest generations, adab was the primary way by which people would achieve excellence. Because their circumstance was relatively close to excellence. Right? They were among the best of generations. They weren't so far removed. And merely by emphasizing adab, they would achieve their goal of excellence. So that was like a tariqa. And then, over time, there became an appreciation that the world and the dunya had derailed people from their goal. And then you'll see in the next generations later, a large emphasis was placed on what they called mujahida. Mujahida means struggle against the nafs. Eat less, sleep less, speak less. And then you'll see a characteristic arise within the scholars of that time to emphasize this because they felt that this was the key feature that was needed. And then over time, again now centuries, over time, eventually you begin to appreciate it more currently, there's a strong emphasis on dhikr. Because to tell people, avoid, crush your nafs, crush your animalistic desires is so difficult in this day and age because there's so much abundance available. Yes, we make some emphasis on it, but there's so much abundance available, it's almost like a moot point. So you'll see nowadays a lot of the mashayikh and the scholars of this science, they put a strong emphasis on this idea of doing extra dhikr and avoiding sin. Avoiding sin is always there. These are all, again, key features that are always present. They're basal features that need to be expressed and constitutively in every Muslim. But sometimes there needs to be an overexpression of a particular feature. So an overexpression of adab, or an overexpression of dhikr, or an overexpression of an emphasis on avoiding sin, or an overexpression on subjugating the nafs. So these are what formed the tariqas. Now, in the end, they all have to express. Again, I said these are all basal characteristics. They're constitutive. They must always be expressed. But it's the overexpression at various times and places in various individuals that would then define these various tariqas. And of course, then the mashayikh that would practice them and would exemplify them and would call others to them. So this is essentially what we mean by tariqa. And the final term that often is used is silsila. Silsila basically means chain, and the reason that this term is used is because often when a person wants to develop spiritually, they're going to seek an individual that can assist them in that development. And that individual will have learned under another individual. And that individual will have learned under another individual. So that forms what's called a chain or a silsila. So sometimes this term is used for this particular science because a defining characteristic of the people who are teaching it is that they have a silsila tracing them back in their that gives them the confidence that they've learned this science and can eventually then teach it to others. So sometimes you'll hear the word silsila as well. So these are some of the terms that are thrown around concerning this science. I think what I would like to say, and perhaps most importantly, let's summate this whole conversation in just one principle. Like I've already mentioned, this field and its names is marred with historical and cultural baggage, so I'm hesitant often to use names because I don't know what's meant. But I think what we can say with confidence, and maybe what I would like to just, the summation of all of this, is that regardless of the name that we use, we need to establish one core principle. Regardless of the name that we use, in the context of my speaking with you, I want to establish one underlying core principle. And that is this very famous statement that is, there is no tariqa without Sunnah and Sharia. This is the take home. There is no tariqa without Sunnah and Sharia. So essentially what I'm saying is that our path of spiritual development is bound by the remaining tenets of Deen. Listen very carefully. Our path of spiritual development is bound by the remaining tenets of Deen. There is, in our book, there is no better way to achieve consciousness of Allah than through the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that is our mantle. We do not budge from that principle. And there's this famous statement again, there is no Tariqa without Sunnah and Sharia. Now, they use the word Tariqa here because the ending rhymes with Sharia, so you can easily remember it. It's a common statement that you'll hear if you pick up the books of this particular field. There is no Tariqa without Sunnah and Sharia. What that means is that, simply stated, the Sharia is the legal dimension of Islam. It forms the container in which spirituality is placed. We cannot leave the Sharia, and we cannot leave the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the way. All we can do is we can overexpress various aspects. All these are constitutive, they're always expressed, but like proteins in the cell that express themselves at different times and in different circumstances, we can take and we can overexpress one or the other aspect of the Sunnah in order to drive people towards the goal of ihsan. So simply put, we form the legal framework, it's essential. We then take various aspects of the Sunnah and advise and guide depending on the individual and depending on the time and place. And that's literally what the mashayikh do. That's literally when I'm dealing with people, that's literally what I'm doing. I'm talking to them, I'm getting to know them, I'm understanding the circumstance, I'm seeing their time and place, and I'm advising them individually and collectively based on my observations and my experience and the knowledge that I gained from my teachers. Again, this is highlighted in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهِ. Say, and this is a command to the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, say to the companions and through them to the entire ummah, if you love Allah, فَاتَّبِعُونِي, follow me. Okay, ittaba'a yattabi'u in the Arabic language is an advanced form, it's an extended form of a verb. Taba'a is the verb to follow. Ittaba'a yattabi'u is a reflexive following footstep by footstep. So what's being said here? If you love Allah, follow me. Step by step, footstep by footstep, follow the Sunnah. Follow me, here is the Prophet ﷺ is being addressed, correct? Follow the Sunnah. يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهِ. The consequence will be that Allah will love you. Consequence 1, Allah will love you. Consequence 2, وَيَغْفِرُ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ, and He will forgive you your sins. These are two of the key goals in ihsan. To attain the love of Allah and to have our sins forgiven. So what this ayah is showing us is that we cannot deviate from the Sunnah even one footstep. We cannot deviate from the Sunnah even one footstep. We need to identify what is the Sunnah and emulate it to the best of our ability. And in fact, I will argue that historically, if you really want to see emulation of the Sunnah, you tend to find it in the people of spiritual development. They put a huge premium on this because of this principle, that the Sunnah is the way. It's the path. It is the Tariqa. It is the essential Tariqa. Any other name of any other Tariqa can only be through an overexpression of one particular feature or another. Wallahu ghafurur rahim. Allah is forgiving and Allah is merciful. Now, as a last point, I'll say that all Islamic sciences are bound by each other, including Tasawwuf. All Islamic sciences are bound by one another, including Tasawwuf. Now, what does that mean? What I'm trying to say here is that Tasawwuf is this Islamic branch of Islamic science. By the way, I'm going to use Tasawwuf commonly as a term moving forward. Okay, so you understand now what I mean by that. We've clarified it, so now I'm very comfortable using a term that everybody in the room understands and we can communicate with now. So all sciences are bound by each other. What this means is that, let's take an example. Let's put Tasawwuf away for a second. If a person wants to do tafsir of the Quran, that's a science, correct? That's a science of our deen. وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ teaches the book and the wisdom. So teaching the book is part of our science, the science of our deen. This science is bound by the other sciences. I can't just show up one day and just start randomly making interpretations of what I think one verse means versus another. I'm bound by what did the hadith say, what does the Arabic language say, what do the other scholars say, what is the meaning in the context of how it occurred, what does the seerah have to say, etc. Does that make sense? So tafsir is bound by all these other subjects. If I go to an extreme and I start doing tafsir on my own, deviating from the subjects, we don't call that tafsir anymore. In fact, that's completely impermissible. That's a danger, right? There's a danger associated with interpretation of the Quran, because by interpretation of the Quran, you can also misinterpret the Quran. So anytime we would engage in that, we are opening the door to danger. So in the same way, in the science of Tasawwuf, you open the door to danger. Because now you could say, there's a lot of ways to spiritually develop, there's a lot of goals that you could have in spiritual development. But we are bound by all the other tenets of Islam. We're bound by all the other fields of Islam. We're bound by fiqh, we're bound by the Sunnah, we're bound by the Sharia, we're bound by the understanding of our scholars that came before us. So that's very important as well. Because otherwise, we can end up in left field. And we certainly don't want to end up in left field with our deen. That's the one thing that actually means the most to us. So we have to be particular about that as well. All right, this completes this particular section.